This is ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My name is Alice Li Hagan. Thank you for joining us. Today we have an expert futurist who is going to use his foresight to help us understand some of the issues affecting Hawaii, issues about culture, identity, and we're hoping to talk about a vision that would reframe the future of Hawaii. My guest is Kaipo Lum. He is the founder of Vision Foresight Strategy, a Hawaii-based foresight and strategic analysis company. His training and expertise is in strategic formulation and planning process design. Kaipo will share with us some of his professional interests, as I mentioned earlier on, about culture and identity here. Well, thank you, Kaipo, for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Well, when I was preparing the interview, I mentioned to you earlier on, I was looking up information, but what we talked about 15 minutes ago, I wasn't expecting that. So I will ask you some of those questions, but first of all, tell us what is futurist? What is this training all about?
So I came out of the Future Studies program at the University of Hawaii in Manoa in the Political Science Department. Jim Dater, Professor Dater, who just retired this past summer, started the program back in the 70s, and he, for the last 40, 50 years or so, has been training folks in future studies. And as a field, future studies is relatively unknown, so...
It's new, right? Because you said that he started in the 70s.
Right.
Okay.
And so some of the history, some of the roots of future studies go back several decades, but as an academic field, I think you probably look at it coming together and coming out of the 70s and stuff, 60s and 70s. As a field, future studies is trying to, or it's mainly concerned with trying to understand and anticipate change in society.
Okay.
And so from an academic point of view, that's what it's trying to do. And it's got two halves to it, right?
Okay.
One part of future studies is trying to do that analytic part, the forecast, the how does change happen, why will it happen? But the other part of future studies, which a lot of people don't sort of realize that goes along with it, is that stuff is just a springboard for then asking the question, what do you want the future to look like?
Okay, so that's a lot of information there, and we can go into many directions. So I guess in layman's term, are we trying to look at the crystal wall?
that image is never going to stop plaguing us. One way to think about what we do is the difference between prediction and forecasting. Okay.
Okay.
And for our purposes, a crystal ball, which you should buy in bulk, by the way. That's an example of predicting, right?
Okay.
I see the future,
okay.
right? So this is the thing that's going to happen. You can bet your money on it.
Okay. And
so a prediction is a statement about the future that's meant to be accurate.
Okay. All right. So are there bases to it? How do you make sure that it's accurate?
Well, so that's a prediction. A forecast, in contrast, is a statement about the future that's meant to be logical, but not necessarily meant to be the right guess. So the difference between trying to do a prediction and doing forecasts. So you do multiple forecasts. And so what we end up doing is, and we were taught very strongly, we have no ability to predict. And so much of our work on the foresight part is trying to do different types of forecasts about how things could happen, why they would change.
Okay, and so that would be based on very strong evidence that you have from the past, or how does that work?
Depends on the topic that you're dealing with, depends on the client, depends on the engagement. Jim Dater was always very clear with us. If you're not basing your forecasts on a theory of change and stability, you're just making stuff up. But there are many different models of change. There's many different theories about why things change, why the economy changes, why communities change. So there are competing theories. And then you're looking at trends, you're looking at trend data, but you're also doing something called emerging issues analysis. And so in contrast to most business that, you're taught do a trend forecast, right? Emerging issues analysis is saying, we see a lot of things emerging in the last few decades and today that don't have a precedent, right? They don't have historical data to talk about them. And so you're having to do a different type of analysis to identify early on things that might become important technologies or issues or trends.
Okay, I see. Okay, let's go back to forecast, because what you explained now, then it reminded me of, okay, maybe it's like weather forecast, but again, that's coming from somebody who doesn't understand your view. Now, based on your academic training, you started your company. So why did you do that? And especially, I know that your background is more in healthcare. You worked at HMSA for a while, right?
I was in college. I was in grad school, and finally got to the point where you needed a job, and I got a job at HMSA. And because I was in the futures program, we were, you're reading the literature in the field. And one day I was at HMSA. I fixed the carpet tiles, and we did the modular furniture. That was my part-time job. And one day I had to go to an office and change a light bulb or something, and they had a book on the desk. The manager had a book on the desk, and it was one of the ones we had read, of course. And I was just offhand like, "Hey, that's a good book." And she was like, because I was like just bora bora and shorts and whatever, and she was like, "Do you know that book?" And I was like, "Yeah." Da 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 da. And I got hired, and so I got my first job while I was in grad school, just through that sort of happenstance. Okay. And so I was in HMSA for several years, and when we got to 2003, I'm Gen X. This was the height of Fast Company and Free Agent Nation, and everybody was going to be an independent consultant. And all of my colleagues, all of my friends, were either already independent consultants or they were just friends locally who were all jumping ship because everybody was going to be their own independent business. And I had basically outgrown my job, and everybody else in my cohort was doing it. And so I ended up in 2004 leaving HMSA and doing this full time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was in 2004. Can you tell us some of the projects that you have done using your training as a futurist?
So in the business and in the types of projects that we do, for us it runs a spectrum with pure foresight on one end, which is companies like come help us talk about the future, and just sort of classic dyed-in-the-wool strategic planning on the other. And that's partly interest and partly I was trained in futures, and I spent 7 years as the corporate and strategic planner at HMSA I was sort of chained in a cubicle to do nothing but, think about strategic planning. And so the projects of the last few years have been a range of strategy to foresight and mixes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
How does it work? Because I've been through some of the strategic workshops. So how do you add this piece of foresight into it? How does it complement it?
So, if you take like a classic, and at HMSA, one of my jobs was always to sort of edit the annual report for the board and things like that. And we're not going to talk about any of the details in them, but much of it was sort of classic. Here are some of the basic trends that we've identified, and each year you update those trends. Very classic planning. And what the foresight piece brings to it is a much more critical and comprehensive approach for asking how and why could the future be different. And it often starts by assuming that there's many possibilities, right? When you do a trend extrapolation, you're sort of feeling like there's one particular direction or there's one particular future. And futures gets in there and really questions everybody's assumptions about why will things change, how could they change, and let's get really with that.
Okay. What is the significance of it? I mean, how and why future is different. So what do people actually do with this information?
So you'll do things, one of the common things that people are familiar with, you'll have say scenarios, right? Global Business Network, very much popularized the idea of scenario planning. But if you take the idea of scenarios, you create 3, 4, 5 scenarios. They're different possible futures, right? And so you've now got a set of different possible futures that you're looking at. And so your planning team, your executive team, your leadership is now, they've gone through the process of creating those. So they've been looking at different ideas about, different models about how the world works, different trends and issues, different interactions, different emergent patterns. They've been looking at all these different things. They're getting much better at thinking about change and being sensitive to the types of changes that could happen. And in the process of developing these scenarios, as an example of a project, you're doing several things. You're thinking through ahead of time different possible trajectories and outcomes, right? So you've already thought through that stuff. You've used that to help develop indicators that help tell you which directions that the world might be going. You've thought through, and the group now has the same language about the kinds of changes that we might be anticipating, right, across the spectrum. And the most fun thing is through that process, most groups walk away going, or having a much more nuanced and ambitious idea of what they now want to have happen.
Okay.
Because they've now looked through lots of possibilities that they hadn't thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're in a much better place to go, you know what, I think we want a different future.
Okay. We want a very different future. Now, that's, I guess for me, this is all very theoretical. Is there a real life situation that you can talk about and applying some of the process that you just described?
So in 2011, we were part of a project, a very big Foresight project for PepsiCo. And
PepsiCo is
the Fortune 50, right? We were tagged on as part of a very small team to help develop scenarios.
okay.
And they were global scenarios, so they were scenarios to help Pepsi look at the world. And we were, helping some of the research and engineering folks. And so you go through this process, and so lots of teams across the country, and you work with them, and you develop, and we developed a set of scenarios looking at different ways that the world could turn to help Pepsi think through, and at least for these guys, what would that mean for not just business in the general sense, but what does that mean for supply chains? What does that mean for factories, for manufacturing? What does that mean for resources? What does that mean for the politics and conflict? And you should have. And so those guys are using the scenarios to think through those things. One, again, to help flush out possibilities. Like, oh, we hadn't thought of that. That's a logical possibility. But also to help galvanize them and sort of get them to see the things that they might actually now want to build, right? Because they now thought through how some of these things could play out, and they go, that thing actually would be really cool. Let's figure out how we build that.
So, but how does it filter down to the operational level? Because it's still, for me, a very high-level concept because you come up with these scenarios. But at the end, businesses are business, and we talked about it earlier on. They have to generate revenue, generate profit, and people have to determine how to execute some of the ideas. So how do you trickle down to the operational level then?
For the immediate Foresight product, the scenarios of that stuff, normally the next step is using them for, like I said, indicators, right? Sets of indicators. They use it for strategy development, straight strategy development. Here's A, B, C, and D. Let's develop strategies that would work in these. They use it for innovation and product development, right? They use it to identify potential new market spaces that they're going to design. And again, like I said, like the engineering folks are like, oh, okay, now how would we do that thing? And so they will kick off, it'll start to sort of filter out into however that organization does its planning devolution. It'll start to go down to, this is your research portfolio, this is the stuff, and this is the new messaging, and da-da-da-da, and it'll start to sort of go out like that.
Okay. Now, I also have gone on the website to look at how people apply futures thinkings or foresight. Government sectors do that, businesses, even at the personal level. So in your business, do you have clients that are more in the government or in the public or in the private sector then?
At the moment, more in the government sector. And for the last year or so, it's been shifting a little bit more to just various government agencies. My personal experience is it just sort of ebbs and flows. There are folks in any consulting sector that specialize in one type of client. For me, I've always moved between nonprofits, for-profits, government agencies, because a lot of what we do, it's referrals and it's networks, and so it happens to be who was there in the session or who was part of the project, or somebody said, hey, we use this guy and you got to use him.
I'm glad you brought up nonprofit because I haven't thought about that. So maybe you can hold that thought and then we can continue with that. Let's take a short break. My guest is Kaipo Lum. He is the founder of Vision Foresight Strategy. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. I'm here with Liz Hsu, and we love agritech. In fact, she's from the Department of Agriculture, and we're underwater, gurgle, 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 and we love things that have to do with agriculture, aquaponics, hydroponics, all that. So Liz, what is your interest in this?
To grow more local food for local people.
I knew that.
Yes.
Okay, it's 4 to 5 every other Monday. come and see us on Agritech in the Islands. I'm Jay Fidel. Come learn with us. We'll see you then.
Aloha.
Welcome back. My name is Alice Li Hagan, and you are watching ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. If you're just joining us, my guest is Kaipo Lum. He is the founder of Vision Foresight Strategy. Before the break, we were talking about how he would apply foresight and strategy formulation to help public and private sectors to formulate their strategies, I guess. Now, Kaipo, we were talking about nonprofit, that you most of your clients are from the government and nonprofit sectors. So tell us about nonprofit and how they would benefit from your consulting work.
So most of the nonprofits, and we've done a fair number of nonprofits over the last few years, they, in some respects, they benefit in the same ways. Nonprofits, and particularly a lot of nonprofits tend to be smaller. They tend to be more strapped for discretionary funds. And so, like everybody else, they need planning, they need to have strategic conversations. And because they're smaller staffed and they have often more specific and limited skill sets, because they're sort of focused on their mission and they're smaller, they often lack what the big companies have in terms of a planning unit and marketing folks. So they often don't have any internal sort of big, strong competencies around foresight and talking about the future. And so in many of the ways, it's the same sort of benefit. It's just they're a little bit more excited maybe to have it.
So do you feel that perhaps because of the resources that bigger companies have, with nonprofit, this is a pioneering area, something that's very new to them?
It often is very new to them in the sense that, like a lot of people, they've never heard of futures. They, having time or resources to do future stuff and big picture strategy, often I found is a little bit more of a luxury for them than some of the mid and big companies that do that kind of stuff all the time. So it's more of a novelty in that sense, like we haven't gotten to do this, you know, in a long, long time. I can tell you one of the fun differences between nonprofits and what they get excited about versus for-profits and government agencies. Unlike the other two, nonprofits, and I think just naturally because they are socially motivated and what they're about, they are about trying to make the world a better place, right? Most of them, that's what they're motivated by. So that second part of futures, which is coming up with a better future, right, and articulating that vision, going after that, they're often much more just naturally in alignment with that conversation because they're already there in a sense. And so when you come in, you're helping broaden that conversation that they want to have. Whereas on the for-profit side, they don't quite have the same, you know, what's the future we want story. For-profits, and not to be disparaging, but for-profits have different constraints and different incentives, and so, you know, they have a preferred future, but often it's articulated in terms of market share and revenues. The nonprofits, right, it's like health outcomes and better communities and healthier people and that kind of thing. So that just simply lends itself to having a much bigger and more critical conversation about what should the future look like?
So do you see the impact after a conversation like this? Do you see a difference in the impact for the nonprofit as opposed to the private sector, perhaps?
I think and this might be less the sector and more the size of the organization. Because nonprofits tend to be smaller, I think you have a greater chance as a consultant in general to have your stuff make an impact on thinking, because you basically put all the brains in the room, so they've all been exposed to that conversation. And because they don't have lots of processes and admin things going on, or not as much, it's more likely that the stuff that you create with them that somebody's going to use. You go to, like when we did Pepsi, that was a big expensive project and it was a lot of fun, but it was a tiny little thing connected to a giant org chart. And it frankly was by happenstance that the work that I did got presented to Indra Nooyi, but that was chance. It was just an alignment of the stars. If it had been any other year, right, it would have just gone here and stopped at this vice president.
Well, I mean, that's very humble of you to say that, but I'm sure that there are some really critical information. You must have done a lot of hard work to get there.
My team members swear that I did a lot of hard work, but I always, nothing's perfection, so it's never good enough.
Well, let's switch gear and move on to something that I mentioned is really interesting about culture and identity of Hawaii. And you were saying that these are some issues that you're passionate about, and they have implications for Hawaii. Tell us about your perspective on that.
So we'll be academic for a second.
Okay.
You know, you're asking how do we do these things and how do we come about it? We have lots of different models. We have lots of different frameworks, and they are usually different than the way most of us were taught to think in high school and when we went out in the world. And one of those ways is to see the world in terms of layers, right? And so for simplicity, we could say, let's say that society has 3 layers, and we can get very different, but at the surface is that top layer, and that's daily life. That's pink is the new black, and that's iPhone 6. No, wait, iPhone 6S, and
Oh,
right?
okay.
Okay.
I can't keep up, so.
And that's the sort of the daily that it does this.
Uh-huh.
Right? You could drop one level down and talk about a structural level in society. This is where we have infrastructure and institutions and laws, right? And these things don't change as fast, right? But when they do change, they change the context for the things above them. You can't have an iPhone S that really works without, 4G networks and all that stuff,
Correct,
right?
yes.
So when these things they're harder to change, but when they change, they tend to move the things above them. You could drop down another layer and call this your worldview layer. And this is where you find values and mythology and narratives and stories and priorities and all those things. And those things tend to take generations to change,
Yes.
right? Now they're like an iceberg, right? So when they move, they tend to take everything above them with them. You can have shocks, you can have 9/11s, right? That sort of rip through and reconfigure everything. But if you think about that, right, you could then look at some place like Hawaii and ask questions about, well, what's important to the future of Hawaii? And so it's not just the sort of the more surface level questions of, what's the number of jobs in tourism next year, right? Which is not an unimportant question. Just you can dig down and ask questions about identity and culture, and so
these are the deeper questions that you're really interested in.
You're trying to sort of peel down to in a sense, the soft, squishy human things that actually impact choices, decisions, preferences.
So what would they be? Those soft, squishy human questions that.
So we could take an example like, what do you think, Alice, about the state having the ability to know all of your secrets versus you as an individual being able to keep your life private?
Do I have to answer that?
But this is where you dig down, and when you get a group and you're exploring these things, right? It's connected to their upbringing and their education and their values and their cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, I was going to say it really depends on where you come from, and I guess if you are from a conservative, Asian culture, I actually don't mind that the government knows a little bit about me. But then I know that there are other cultures. Well, I'm not sure if it's culture or people who say, oh, absolutely not. But yeah, so.
And I'll give you another example. When I was in college, when I was at UH, I had a history class, and I got a chance to use some specifically futures framework. So Alvin Toffler, who's a very famous futurist, he wrote a book called The Third Wave.
Yes. And
he talked about first wave, second wave, and third wave societies, right? So first wave are agrarian, second wave are industrial, and third wave like information society, right? And I had to look at this report that was produced in Hawaii back in the 1800s. It was all reports from the different islands, from clergy, from religious, from ministers and priests, and reporting on their parishes. And so I had to read through this and sort of do a report on it. And if we take the worldview layer, you can see the differences. And so the comments in there were about how, Hawaiians were wonderful and they were great, but, they really were sort of lazy and they weren't super hardworking. And in the middle of the day, they just want to stop and they just want to not do this. But if you change the lenses with which you're trying to understand that, right? So I was using Toffler's back then in grad school, and you have a first wave society and the way they understand the world. So the hottest part of the day, why would you be out in the field, right? And you live in a sort of a material abundance, so you don't need to be cranking like factory, but being evaluated by a second wave worldview, which came from a very industrial, mechanistic, Newtonian. And again, so like when
there's a clash there then.
But you got to dig down to that, right, to unpack that. to start to see where the conflicts are, where the differences are, and then that bubbles back up the levels to influence how we like each other and the things that we think are important and things like that.
So that was from the 1800s. So how far along have we progressed?
In terms of, say, Tofflers?
Or how we try to understand people from a different culture. You talked about first and second waves, but I guess do we still make that distinction at this current time and era?
I would say my sense is we still do sort of a poor job being sensitive and looking at each other with that sort of worldview sensitivity.
Any concrete examples?
So like you and I could sit down and go have coffee, and I'm going to typically just sort of make the assumption that, you know, we see the world the same way and whatnot. But in real life, right, we have to actually get to know each other to sort of realize, oh no, Alice she totally doesn't see that stuff like that, right? So again, like the thing with government, right? So we could be sitting around talking about like NSA and this is terrible and this is a breach and all this stuff, and you'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's totally fine. Like, because your notion about the state and its role in the world is different than the one that I was raised with. And then the one that I was raised with was very classic American distrust power. People shouldn't have too much power, distrust the government. And so you're built to these things, and it influences. So when we come around to talk about the future, both how you anticipate what's going to happen versus what you want to see happen, right, is influenced by all these types of things.
Right. Well, and I guess as individuals, we're all very different. So that really, what is the significance of all this? Just trying to know that, okay, we have different lenses, we look at things differently. I mean, things seem to be fine, so why do we have to worry about
So
this?
if we take like one of the things I like, which is the future of governance, right? We could do, we work on looking at what the future of governance, constitutional governance might look like. And so you're looking at various trends, various emerging issues, you're looking at different theories about how institutions change. But we could come back to this difference in worldview in terms of what the role of government is and the role of citizens. And how you and I differ in how we respond to these scenarios, right? Absolutely ripples to the strategies and policies that we would support. It absolutely ripples to the conversations that we have. And when we're talking about new technologies, emerging issues, new trends, so it'd be interesting, of course, in an offline conversation to talk to you about the umbrella protests in Hong Kong, and right, because you know Americans are jacked like democracy. It's a big wave. It's gonna happen, and you know other people are like.
No, this has to be an offline conversation, absolutely.
Right. So how we react to what's possible in the future, right? So if we don't understand a lot of this stuff, just like conflict res, right? If we don't understand a lot of these differences, understanding how we interpret the future differently, how our forecasts are influenced by these things and all that stuff, and it's just part of what we do. There's trend data in there. There's just part of what you do.
Well, but then I guess we got distracted because I was really hoping to ask you more about the culture and the Hawaiian identity. So maybe we can talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
Let's take a short break. My guest is Richard Lum, the founder of Vision Foresight Strategy. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel, CEO of ThinkTech. On Thursday, December 11th, we're having our annual reunion party. We call it ThinkTech United. It's at the Laniakea YWCA. It's for our speakers and hosts and moderators and friends. Please come down. Everybody is invited to be united. We'll see you there. Check our website for details. Aloha.
Aloha. My name is David Day. I host ThinkTech Asia, and we talk about international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and we broadcast live every Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock and on Olelo 54. Make sure you tune in, and we'll see you there.
Welcome back. This is ThinkTech Hawaii BizEd Spotlight. If you're just joining us, my guest is Kaipo Lum. He is the founder of Vision Foresight Strategy. Kaipo, now there are so many aspects of world issues that you can apply foresight to. So let's come back here to Hawaii. Some of the critical issues that you think to create some kind of vision for Hawaii. So what would that be?
So if we're looking at, so if it's the question of, what's critical to the future of Hawaii type of thing, certainly there's an economic aspect to it. But again, I'd try to dig down a little bit deeper, and it's not just, how big is tourism as an industry going to be, or how many hotel jobs there are going to be, but because of the many different families of technologies that are out there that are being developed, that are potentially disruptive technologies in the way we do things. When you're looking at economic futures today, you're really trying to dig a little bit deeper and ask how far could economic life change, right? And there's a way that we produce things today, and with how we get the energy for it, and distribute it, and sell it, and use it, and dump it, right, and all this kind of stuff. And so you're looking at biology as a technology. You're looking at nanotech as types of technology. You're looking at automation, right? You're looking at digital fabrication. You're looking at all these things, and you're asking, in conjunction with all of these other new ideas about business models and economic models and people's dissatisfaction with the way we work and life and all this stuff, how does all of these things mix and co-evolve in such a way that, again, economic life will be changed as it was in the past?
So I guess the question is, what is underlying all these perception about the economic life? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Part of it is perception, right? Because again, perception plays a strong role in what we choose to develop and put money behind. It's also what we consider as important, what we ignore. But it's partly perception, but it's also partly just there's so much going on, there's so much innovation, there's so much scientific development, there's so many, everybody's exposed to everything. You're in a very sort of unprecedented place in history where there is so much going on in so many different directions. It becomes very, very difficult to sort of wrap your head around all the things that could transform some part of life. But for Hawaii, economic life, with all of these changes, are something you really want to sort of look at and ask, how could a place as isolated as Hawaii, as totally dependent on external inflows of stuff, rethink and sort of imagine economic life? And I don't mean like living on farms, but how could you be part of the 21st century world, but taking all of these families of developments and literally creating an economic life that did what you wanted it to do?
So you're talking about sustainability then?
Sustainability is an aspect of it.
Okay.
But you have healthcare in there. You have just so many other things. Sustainability becomes, in a sense, one metric, one lens with which to sort of view your economic system.
Okay. Well, another aspect that you mentioned earlier on is cultural identity. How is that significant for us here?
So people of course, they always ask me, like, what do you think is the most important thing for the future of Hawaii? And there's a part of me that always wants to respond culture. And I know when, if you say culture locally, most people automatically kind of assume you must be talking about like Hawaiian culture. But I mean culture in a broader sense, right? Culture, local culture, Hawaii culture, and all the parts within that. Excuse me. And, again, a lot of it goes back to sort of worldview and values. But it's also partly about connectivity and affinity and identity. And so, classically coming out of the 70s, you'd have these questions that I think don't get asked so much anymore, but these questions people were debating about, is there a local identity, right? And as a child born in the 70s and growing up, I think I grew up out of that tail end of that narrative that said, oh yeah, there's a common us, right? And I sort of get the feeling the further we get into the future, the less that's so.
Yeah, interesting you should mention that, because when I left Hong Kong 25 years ago, I didn't ask that question there, but I grew up, I always tell people I'm the product of a colony. But it's only when I went away that question came up. But yeah, we don't talk about it, but I don't think Asians talk about that.
And it's totally good. And like we were saying, earlier, in Hawaii, not just sort of general American political correctness, but you don't want to offend people, and you don't want to get yelled at. And so having deeper, potentially provocative conversations about identity and multiple identities that people carry, and how that messes up the clean picture of Hawaii that we paint for ourselves,
Do you think people should talk about that then?
I think people should absolutely talk about that stuff. That stuff is again, it's related to identity. Identity is related to loyalty, right? What communities are you loyal to? And not in the militant sense, just where are your loyalties? And it's absolutely related to values and preferences, and then it gets back to worldview and how we perceive the world and the different ways in which people perceive the world. And if we just sort of brush it under the rug and go, oh yeah, we're all nice to each other, let's not talk about that. One of the things you miss is the opportunity to bring all of those different worldviews out and, in a sense, pull from them the different beneficial or desirable images of the future or values that you could be woven into a vision of the future for Hawaii that everybody actually would like.
Now, are there perhaps other countries that do a better job in talking about their identity?
I think there's other places that are more explicit, but I don't know that it's in a sense. I think it's more like sort of, and again, at a remove, my sense of it being a little bit more about categorization and much stronger sort of ethnic differences. Whereas, and part of the reason why not only do I think it's actually very important if we want to be able to come up with a vision for the future that is a better Hawaii, that we all actually want to be part of, that we have to sort of engage some of this stuff. But we are and have been a sort of a precursor or sort of a precedent for the rest of the world in a lot of ways. And sort of multicultural, multi-layered, overlapping identities is one of them. We've had them for a while. Other parts of the world will increasingly have them. And so there is a sort of a closing window, I think, for us to find a way to be an exemplar. Not the way, but an example of how people can do this.
So how would you start engaging people in a conversation like that, and at the same time to be really vigilant of being politically correct?
There's that is a very, very hard one. In most of the conversations I've had, you know, and I think Hawaiians know who you can talk with about these things and who you can't. People get it's identity. See, and that's the thing, right? It's identity, and it's our notions of our culture and our identity. And so you get, when you're not comfortable in your own skin in a way, right? You get very, very defensive very easily about it. And I think a lot of us do. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people over the years, like, okay, like, how do you do it, right? And people have tried, right? There were, I forget the name of the group, but they used to meet in Manoa back, I think, in the 90s. They specifically would bring Hawaiians and non-Hawaiians together to talk, just to sort of talk story and talk about the past and do these things. And they specifically created a very safe space in which, you know, people would get together and spend an evening together. But again, now this relates to like governance and civil society, and the idea that politics is not sort of getting rid of differences or making everybody like, oh, everybody feels good. We have to actually get better at having disagreements and sort of talking through them and working through them rather than like just going ballistic on each other, which, you know, we all have a tendency to do. And somebody pointed out to me, I was fascinated by Scotland, right, as a political scientist, and Scotland and the question, right?
Right, the referendum, yes.
After that, I was in D.C. a couple of weeks ago. I was having lunch with somebody, and they pointed out a really great point, and that was, in this age of ISIL and Putin on the run doing all kinds of stuff and all of this conflict, Scotland is a great example of a very potentially divisive issue, an issue in which clearly, you know, large chunks of the population differed, huge stakes. It's a constitutional question. They got through that. They did it, and the guys who lost the question then said, okay, everybody spoke, and it didn't have an immediate hissy fit. It didn't degenerate into stuff. And the person I was having lunch with was pointing out, we need more examples that you can have as a political community, differences, but that you can differ, reach a decision, and start to try and move on, and not have it all go sideways. And so that was, I think, an interesting.
Well, I guess it's Scotland and I guess it's Canada when the French Canadians voted to separate, but I guess they didn't get their wish, but that was by a very thin margin. Do you think perhaps that's more unique rather than, yeah, it's unusual that it was such a peaceful process.
I think, and there are folks, so I'm a political scientist, but there's lots of specialties, so I'm going to start to talk outside of my area, and there are statistical forecasters that could talk to you about political conflict.
Okay.
But, you know, my sense, again, not being an expert in it, is, you know, again, it's very much context, right? And so, for example, in creating constitutions in Germany and Japan after World War II, there's all kinds of debates about why that worked and why it didn't work in the 60s in decolonization and creating constitutions in Africa, right? And how come Germany and Japan actually never lost its constitution. It was a clear line. Like they changed their constitution, but nothing broke down.
Okay.
Germany, they destroyed them. They destroyed their own government in retreat, and we had to rebuild it. But they took right to it, and they took over their own government, and so it's this question about, well, is that the normal? Is there a special context in which a society has to sort of exist in order to have these transitions that are relatively peaceful and free of conflict? And I actually don't have an answer for that.
Okay, well, we tried.
Yeah.
Now, if there are two things that you want the audience to remember about whether it be strategy formulation or about looking at, you know, the future, what would those two things be?
I think with looking at the future, one of the things, or what you really want to be sensitive to, is the fact that you start with the notion in your head that there are right now many possible futures in front of me. Okay, so you start with that assumption so that any of your planning, any of your research, any of your conversations starts with that as the background. So you're asking questions about, well, what are the different ways that it could turn out? Why would it do that?
So really keeping an open mind to have different options.
In a sense, yes.
Okay.
In fact, that the future is unwritten, right? And so there are many possibilities, and the related part that gets you excited is because it's unwritten, we still have a role in writing that. Maybe not a big role, right? But you still have a role, and you should be excited by that thought.
And you are, as you continue on your journey as a consultant in foresight and helping people to develop their strategy.
Yes.
Great to have you, Kaipo. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
My conversation has been with Richard Kaipo Lum. He is the founder of Vision Foresight Strategy. Please join us again next week for our program on the UH Cancer Center. Stay tuned for David Day's next show. Aloha.